Now, you know that for orphan drugs there have been some, how should I say, the governments try to relieve companies of a number of requirements to allure and to trigger more investment and more excitement into those orphan indications. And one of those is that usually it needs one efficacy study to show that the drug works. And there's plenty of other support for the companies developing drugs, but let's focus on this one. So usually it is one efficacy study that you need to do besides showing the drug is safe in order to get a drug approved. But this efficacy study must live up to the regulatory standards. In some cases you might get a shortcut, you might try and you might be lucky and get a drug approved, and that has happened in the past. But the message that we heard loud and clear from patient organizations, opinion leaders, and the regulatory authorities, you should not rely on that. If you want to have a fair chance to get a drug approved with that one efficacy study, this study should be designed by the usual pharma rules. And that means double-blind and obviously against placebo. So you need to show that your drug does something more than placebo would do. And we know that in almost every disease we have a placebo effect. So it must be better compared to placebo. And it must be a long enough study, and must be a large enough study from the patient population. And as I mentioned before, we are not taking any shortcuts on this. A global study, United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia, 15 study centers, 6 months, double-blind, placebo-controlled in 129 girls. The discussion we had with the authorities is that this study, if positive, has a fair chance to be the one study that needs to get the drug approved. I mentioned that we are still enrolling patients. So this is a rolling process, so some patients have already been enrolled, have undergone treatment of 6 months and have completed the first part. Some have already completed the second part, the second 6 months of that study. So we are looking forward to the last patient entering into the study, which will then trigger the 6 months towards the last patient completing the treatment phase, and then another 4 weeks to the safety visit. So if we would assume that in the next 2 or 3 months we have that last patient in the study, then it is 7 months to the completion of the first phase and the readout for the primary endpoint. The primary endpoint of that study is reduction in the number of breathing apnea in that patient. And if we should have a significant reduction in those breathing abnormalities, then we will have the milestone hit. You asked for the milestone, so that will be the first milestone. The next step would then be that we meet with the regulatory authorities and we see if they are in agreement that we can move towards filing for approval of that compound. That can be a number of months, obviously, to get the meeting, to get the feedback, prepare the filing. Then once the filing has been accepted by the authorities, it would usually be a 6-month review period, which is another benefit for orphan drugs. Usually it takes at least 12 months and substantially longer to get a drug reviewed by the FDA or the European agencies. For orphan drugs, it's usually a 6-month review. Then you would get the approval of the drug for marketing. And in the case of pediatric orphan drugs, you get an additional benefit, which is a very smart instrument, I have to say, in the United States, which is called a pediatric voucher. So you get a document which tells you that, in fact, you are qualifying to take another drug, not for the one that you just got approved, obviously, to take another drug to FDA and ask them to please do a review for that drug in 6 months' time, compared to the usual 12, 18 months. So in the moment that we might get that voucher, the value to us might be limited because we might not have another drug ready to be filed. But the real clue of that is that you could freely sell that document to somebody else who might have a very urgent need to get a 6-month review because he might be on the market 6 months earlier or 12 months earlier than he would otherwise be. And that is why those pediatric vouchers have been sold at very important amounts lately for about $150 million. You might say, what is the good about it? It is a very smart effort to lure more development money into orphan diseases, first of all, but even more importantly into pediatric orphan indications, which are completely underserved from the past for a number of reasons. So we would get the drug approved, and then the next step is that we must be ready by that time to commercialize the drug, and it is our intention we would do ourselves in the United States and in Europe at least. And it is easier again, you don't need the huge hundreds of sales reps to commercialize and sell that drug, but it is something that you could do with a small team of dedicated medical liaison managers. So orphan drugs are drugs that can be commercialized and brought to patients by companies like Newron, and that is what we intend to do.